In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Elementalist build. This is a level 150 Mage build that uses both Incantations and Sorceries, being able to do all different damage types so they have something for every situation. If you've been wanting to play a caster that can use any spell in the game, then this is the build for you. First up, let's talk about the staff and seal we use for this build. We use the Prince of Death staff and the Golden Order seal. This is going to give you the best setup possible for this build, and I came to that conclusion doing a lot of testing. And I actually tried to do like an Albanarch staff, Dragon Communion Seal combination to see if increasing Arcane, Intelligence, and Faith in some combination would outperform this combination, but it doesn't. The Prince of Death staff and the Golden Order Seal will eventually outperform those. It's possible that at lower levels, the Albanarch staff and the Dragon Communion Seal do better, but since I was testing this at about the stats I was going to play this build at, it doesn't outperform it at this point. If you're playing a, hybrid build or something like that, maybe earlier in the game, like level 100 or lower, you might consider that combination, but it doesn't work very well for this build compared to what we're doing. I actually tried out the Carrion Regal Scepter here too, just to see how it compared to the Prince of Death staff, and it's almost identical. So you could theoretically use either of these staffs for this point of the game. However, I will note that as soon as you get any more faith, so if you take this levels higher, if you make this build like 160, 170, and you keep increasing faith, you're going to outperform it with the Prince of Death staff. So this staff sort of future-proofs your build. That's not the only reason we use it. For instance, it buffs Ancient Death Rancor and Death spells. Ancient Death Rancor absolutely slaps in this build, which I'm going to showcase. So you want to increase the damage to that. But otherwise, they're almost exactly identical. If you lean into the Full Moon Sorceries, using something like those spells, then you may want to consider the Carrion Regal Staff or Regal Scepter for this part of the game. But otherwise, you're going to go with Prince of Death staff. When it comes to the seal we're using, Golden Order Seal is second to none. It's literally going to give you the most performance with this setup, and nothing else really comes close at this point of the game. Earlier on in the game, some of the other seals kind of give it a run for its money, as I mentioned, Dragon Communion, but later in the game, it outperforms pretty much everything. And something really interesting about this as well is that you get your best bang for your buck at 45 Int and 45 Faith with this seal. You actually get, markedly less incantation scaling going from 45 all the way up to 80-80. Like, it's astounding how much little you get between 45-45 and 80-80. However, the Prince of Death staff really starts to shine after 50 Int and 50 Faith. So you're going to see, like, the sorceries are a little bit weaker than the incantations at this point of the game. But if you progress this build further, the sorceries are actually going to overtake the incantations in terms of damage. So after I landed on those two weapons, I did a bunch of testing with different stat values to see like what's going to give me the best bang for my buck. And this is where I figured out that having 75 intelligence and 45 faith is the best possible damage setup for this build. As I mentioned, 45-45 is ideal for the Golden Order Seal. That's where you're going to get your best bang for your buck right at that point. However, the Prince of Death staff starts to shine after 50. So the higher up you get one of those stats from 50, the more sorcery scaling you get. And by leaving one at 45, faith, and increasing intelligence up to 75, you basically don't lose any, incantation scaling at all. It stays exactly the same, but your sorcery scaling continues to rise as you go higher and higher, which is great. I decided to light on 70 intelligence and 50 faith because that allows you to use every spell in the game. The highest incantations require 50 faith, and the highest sorceries require 70 intelligence. So if you want to be able to use every spell in the game, you're going to go 70-50. If you want max damage, you're going to go 75-45. That's obviously for a level 150 setup. As you progress this build forward, you're able to increase your intelligence to 80 and then your faith up to 80, and you're going to come out with really, really good damage on both of those. But at 150, that's about as good as you can do. I also use the Sacrificial Axe in the offhand for this build in order to give me 4 FP back every time I kill something. We use a lot of FP with this build because we're casting spells constantly. We literally do not have a melee weapon with this build, so getting as much FP back as we can is fantastic. This is optional, though. You don't have to use this. It does increase your equip load by about 5.5, so it can, really hurt your equip load and give you weaker armor, but I really feel like it's beneficial for this build. When it comes to armor for this build, you can really use anything you want that allows you medium roll. You're not going to have very protective armor with this because you have no points in endurance, and I would advise against using a helmet that gives you intelligence that also reduces something. Like, you're not going to have a ton of HP with this build. You're not going to have a ton of FP with this build. You're not going to have a ton of stamina with this build. So reducing them lower to get some more damage is not ideal. We're already skewed heavily to the damage side. So try and use something like the Imp Helmet, which is what I'm using, that increases your intelligence but doesn't have any downside. It also has fairly good protection, and we need a little bit of protection with this build. When it comes to talismans for this build, I like to use the Ritual Sword Talisman, the Green Turtle Talisman, Marika's Source Seal, and Primal Glintstone Blade. The Ritual Sword Talisman increases all of your damage by 10% when you're at full health. This is going to apply to every spell that you use. So this is just like a flat 10% increase. You just have to make sure you stay at full health. Since you're playing at range predominantly, this shouldn't be too hard, and you can always top yourself off if you need to. Green Turtle Talisman is there because you consume stamina when casting spells, and a lot of times you're trying to spam as fast as you can. We don't have any points in endurance. We don't have a huge stamina pool, so we need to regain that stamina as quick as possible so we can go back to casting. Marika's Source Seal here is kind of the flex spot. You can swap this out for any of the Scorpion Charms instead in order to get more damage with a specific type of spell. Like if you're going into a boss fight, you know he's weak to magic, for instance. You can use that because you know you're going to be spamming magic spells. That makes sense. But Marika's Source Seal is great for that situation where you don't know what damage type you need because it's going to apply to all your different spell types. It also gives you more mind, which increases your FP. We're already a little bit on the low side, which is great. So, and you get intelligence and faith out of it, which is, perfect for this build. Additionally, you can use the Ancestral Spirit Horn here. If you have enough damage to kill the things that you're attacking, or you have more than enough, consider swapping this in. This will give you FP when you kill enemies. It'll give you 3 FP. So combined between the axe and this, you'll gain more FP. And it's just really good for this build when you have enough damage to kill things. So try and swap your spells around, see what will give you the most damage, see what enemies are weak to, figure out what it is, and then find out if you need all the damage from, Marika's Source Seal or one of the Scorpion Charms, or you can use this instead. If it's taking you 2 casts anyway to kill an enemy, then this is better than, putting one of those in there. And lastly, we have Primal Glintstone Blade, and this reduces your spell cost by 25%, but your HP by 15%. And what I originally had was higher mind and less vigor, but then when I used this, my health was really low. So what I did instead was pulled points out of mind, dumped them into vigor, then put this on, and you actually come out ahead. It costs you less to cast your spells, and you have more health by a little bit. So it's kind of a better way to go. Again, you're going to be a little bit squishy with this build. You're a mage. There's not a lot we can do about that, but this is going to help with that FP consumption so that you can cast spells at will. When it comes to spells for this build, there's a few that I really like, but you can use pretty much any spell in the game. So I urge you to test spells that you think would be cool. When you get them, just try them out. You're going to meet the requirements for them all. So, if you have a lot of spells in your arsenal, go test them out on like trolls and things and figure out what you like. I have not tested every single spell in the game, but I'm going to list some of the ones that work very, very well for me. So first of all, for physical damage, I did some testing between Stone of Garank and Rock Sling. The advantage of Stone Garank is that you can chain it very rapidly, allowing you to cast quickly, and its damage is slightly higher than Rock Sling when you're kind of like unbuffed. However, if you use the Flask of Wondrous Physique to increase your faith, for instance, the Rock Sling spell will actually outperform it because it's a sorcery and you're going to get more out of the faith going towards your sorcery scaling at this point. As I mentioned, Golden Order Seal starts to slow down markedly, but the Prince of Death Staff ramps up. So you'll actually outperform it with Rock Sling if you use faith in your Flask of Wondrous Physique. But if not, regularly, Rock Sling's going to be a little bit less damage. But it does more stagger damage. So depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to stagger an enemy, then you might want to use Rock Sling. If you need to just pump out damage, then Stone of Garank is the way to go. And you can slot both of these for a fight, or just use one of them. It's up to you. Next up, we have Fire, and the spells I like to use here are Black Flame and Catch Flame. Black Flame is just a good all-around spell. It puts a dot on the enemy based off their max health that does, damage. You can charge it up for additional damage. You can usually one-shot a lot of enemies with that charged attack if you catch them off guard. And Catch Flame is really good for melee scenarios where you just don't have time to cast. The enemy stays up on you and you can't get away. Catch Flame is effectively your melee weapon with this build. It still does substantial damage at this point of the game, and it's very, very fast to cast, especially after a dodge roll or while you're sprinting. So learn to use it when you need it. I did some testing with Roiling Magma, and it seems like Black Flame outperforms it in damage. However, Roiling Magma, if you throw it on the ground, it sort of creates this thing that attracts enemies and then explodes, throwing magma everywhere, and it does incredible damage when you do this, but it's not always easy to use mid-combat. If you can use this before you engage in combat, you might be better off than Black Flame if there's a lot of enemies, but otherwise it's going to be difficult to do once you've already aggroed them. Naturally, we have Lightning Spear here. This is your good single-target lightning spell. There are lots of other lightning spells that have, AoEs to them that I didn't include in this build, mostly because their cast times are really long. When you're in the thick of combat, you just don't have time, particularly on some of the later bosses, to get really long casts off, but Lightning Spear is still manageable in most of the cases. For holy damage spells, probably the best two are Litany of Proper Death and Triple Rings of Light. Litany of Proper Death does like an AoE that does shit tons of damage against undead. Make sure they can't resurrect. You don't have a melee weapon, so that's really good against them. And Triple Rings of Light is like sort of like a 3 rings that throws out at modest distance that does really pretty good damage. There aren't a lot of holy damage spells that are really good, so these are the 2 that I recommend. When it comes to magic damage, I like Great Glintstone Shard for just, regular use. It's a good long-range attack that deals modest damage. It's usually pretty good to one-shot regular enemies or 2-shot more difficult enemies. It's just a good one to carry you through the game. And Ancient Deathranker, just absolutely a beast. Like, you can kill big enemies. I just recommend using this. Use it on big enemies and just spam the hell out of this. It costs so little stamina, you can just keep spamming it, and it staggers enemies. It does tons of damage with this build. It's really, really good. I know a lot of people think the damage is low, but you just watch the gameplay and you'll see. I like no-hit Gods Can Duo with this spell. It is really, really strong. You can also add other spells to this build, like Loretta's Great Bow if you need some long-range damage, and you're going to swap in spells and out spells depending on what you're facing. That's one of the really great things about this build. You can use any spell in the game. So if you get to a point and you're like, I need some more fire damage, let me try out these other fire spells and see if they work good, do it. Like, there's no downside to it. Like, if you have it, you can use it. So it works really well. We also obviously have Golden Vow for this build. This is going to boost your damage by 15% and give you protection. Wouldn't be complete without. I didn't put Flame Grant Me Strength in with this build because it just has such a short duration. It's not really feasible to use too much during boss fights. You can use it before a boss fight to give you a little extra damage with fire or physical spells, but it only buffs those 2 damage types. And same with Terra Magica. It's very hard to use mid-combat, so, boosting your magic damage is only really viable, like, right at the beginning of the fight, after which point it's kind of difficult to use. You can add them if you're doing a fight where you know you're going to only do physical fire or magic damage, but, like, just for general use, you're not going to use them all that often. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 41 Vigor, 25 Mind, 10 Endurance, 12 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 72 Intelligence, and 50 Faith, and 9 Arcane. The 41 Vigor is there because you are subtracting some of your health, as I mentioned, with the Primal Glintstone Blade, which is going to reduce your health by 15%. So you needed to crank it up high in order to reduce the cost of your spells, so instead of putting those points into Mind, you basically put them into Vigor instead in order to use that. Mind is about as high as we can get it right now. I would love for this to be a lot higher, and if you level up this build further, you're going to want to increase this a lot. 10 Endurance is there because we just don't need Equip Load for this build. Having more stamina would be great for casting, but we just don't have the points for it. We have no need for Strength or Dexterity since we're not using any melee weapons at all. 72 Intelligence is really 70, but I have the Imp Helmet on, and again, as I mentioned, that's the point where you gain access to all sorceries, and 50 Faith is the point where you gain access to all incantations, and I've already explained why I have these breakpoints. We do not need Arcane for this build, but if you wanted to use spells like the Dragon Breath spells or other spells that use Arcane, you could add some points in here and like take some out of Intelligence or something like that if you really wanted to use them. And just a couple recommendations before I wrap up this video. First, test out damage type against enemies. See if you can one-shot them with a spell. If you have to charge it up, if it's chargeable, charge it. Try different damage types. Try putting in the Fire Scorpion Charm with, Black Flame, see if it'll one-shot things. If it still doesn't, pull it out and use something else like, the Ancestral Spirit Horn or whatever. You're going to have to cast 2 anyway. Try different setups and learn what enemies are weak to. You will learn what enemies are weak to far better with this build than any other build. And lastly, if you're going to use the Flask of Wondrous Physique, you probably need to tailor it specifically to what you're fighting. I personally like the one that regenerates stamina for spells or bosses where I need to spam a spell, like Great Glintstone Shard, for instance. If I need to just spam this over and over and over, then, having that extra stamina regen is good. Also, increasing your faith is going to outweigh just about anything at this point in terms of, just every damage type. However, you could use one of the ones that increase a specific damage type, because usually when you're facing bosses, you're going to use all magic or all fire, all physical. There are, one for each one except physical there, so you could use one of them in order to increase your damage instead of putting faith or stamina. Maybe you don't need stamina. Ancient Deathranker isn't super stamina hungry, so you could get rid of the stamina one in that case, take the faith one, and take the magic damage, and it slaps hard. That wraps up this video. I don't know what video I'm going to do next. If you guys have recommendations, let me know in the comments below.